Sometimes you might just have to spin the cue ball sideways. Welcome back, everybody. In today's video, I'd like to talk about applying side spin on the cue ball when shooting a shot. Now, there are many different aspects that we can actually talk about with regards to how side spin affects the cue ball, an object ball, a bank shot, a kick shot, and a variety of other shots. But what I would like to talk about today is how side spin does affect the cue ball and how it changes the angle the cue ball comes off of a rail. And we want to use those two pieces of information to make a shot and play position on the next ball. So let's get started. So first, let's actually talk about how to actually apply side spin on the cue ball. When we're referring to side spin, we're talking about striking the cue ball along its horizontal axis here versus the vertical axis like when we apply top spin or bottom spin. Anytime that we strike the cue ball to the left of its center, we're applying left English on the cue ball. This causes the cue ball to spin in a clockwise motion as it's traveling across the table. Versus when we strike to the right of center, we're applying right English on the cue ball, causing the cue ball to spin in a counterclockwise motion as it's traveling across the table. There's actually two different ways to apply English on the cue ball. For most beginners, it is recommended that you apply what's called backhand English, and that is done by moving your grip hand and leaving your bridge hand still. So if you want to apply left English on the cue ball, we move our grip hand to the right. And as you can see, this causes the tip of the cue to move to the left side of the cue ball so that way we can apply left spin on the cue ball or left English on the cue ball. How much? That's always going to depend on how much spin you want to actually have when you shoot a shot. And then to apply right English on the cue ball, we move our grip hand to the left or closer to our body, which causes the tip of the cue to move to the right side to apply right English on the cue ball. The other way to apply English is what's referred to as front hand English, where we're actually going to move our bridge hand and leave our grip hand still. So to apply left English on the cue ball, we're actually going to move our bridge hand to the left of center to apply left English. And if we want to apply right English on the cue ball, we move our bridge hand to the right of center. For starters, I would probably recommend using backhand English. So what you would want to do is aim your shot using just a center ball hit. And then before you shoot, apply the type of English that you want to have. Take a few practice strokes and then shoot the shot. But then as you get better, you're most likely going to want to switch to using front hand English. Now let's take a look at what effect side spin can have on the cue ball as it's traveling across the table. We all should be pretty well aware that whenever we strike the cue ball down the middle, the cue ball practically goes in a straight line at whatever target that we happen to be aiming at. When we apply left or right English, particularly when we apply it using front hand English, the cue ball will actually deflect off of the line of aim in the opposite direction of the English being applied. Meaning that if I were to apply right English, the cue ball slightly deflects to the left of the line of aim as it's traveling down the table. And if I were to apply left hand English, the cue ball will slightly deflect to the right of the line of aim as it's traveling down the table. Now let me show you what I mean by that. You should see at the end of the table there I have a piece of chalk. That's kind of my target that I'm using, since when I get down and aim I can't actually see the diamond. And what I'm going to do is attempt to hit that piece of chalk with right spin. But if I don't account for that deflection that I was talking about, I expect the cue ball to strike the rail somewhere over here to my left of the chalk. Watch how that works. I'm going to start in the center of the cue ball, and I'm aiming straight at the chalk, And then now I'm going to move my bridge hand to apply right hand English and watch where I hit on the rail. You see how far off the cue ball actually deflected? Now let's apply left hand English on the cue ball and watch it deflect to the right of the line of aim. I forgot to mention on my last shot that I used about 1 tip's worth of right English when we caused the cue ball to deflect to the left. So here I'm going to use about 1 tip's worth of left hand English, and we're going to cause the cue ball to deflect to the right, missing the chalk and contacting the rail somewhere right around here. So I'm going to get down and aim down the center of the cue ball to where I see that I'm hitting my target. Move my bridge hand to apply 1 tip's worth of left hand English, and let's watch where we hit the rail. The cue ball deflects off to the right of the line of aim, missing our target on its right side. Before I show you how to adjust for that cue ball deflection whenever you apply front hand English, let's have a quick look at backhand English, because it doesn't appear that the cue ball deflects whenever you apply backhand English. In this first attempt, I'm going to use 1 tip's worth of right hand English using backhand English. I still start at the center of the cue ball to see that I'm on target, and then I'm going to move my grip hand to apply 1 tip's worth of right English, and let's see where I hit on the rail. And you can see pretty much straight on target. So now let's try left English. I'm on target. I'm going to move my grip hand to apply 1 tip's worth of left English, and let's see where I hit on the rail. Again, still pretty much right on target. The reason for that is whenever you apply side spin using backhand English, you are actually changing the line of aim. Because instead of aiming straight down the center of the table at the chalk whenever you hit the cue ball in the center, when I apply left English, the line of aim actually changes like this when we use it with backhand English. And the cue ball actually does deflect back to the right, but it causes it to go straight on target. Much like when I apply right English using backhand English, this is now our line of aim, and the cue ball will actually deflect off to the left, still going straight on target. Now let's look at how to adjust for the cue ball deflection when applying front hand English. Now, funny enough, until just recently, I don't think I ever actually knew how I was adjusting for the cue ball deflection. I'm pretty sure that just over the course of many years of play and missed shots, I eventually corrected those missed shots and started to make them, which makes me believe that I naturally started to compensate for the cue ball deflection. I'm pretty sure a lot of y'all can actually relate to that. But for everybody else, I don't want to leave you with that. I don't want to tell you to just practice until you naturally start to compensate for the cue ball deflection. So I started to study how I was actually adjusting, and this is what I came up with. When I apply 1 tip's worth of right hand English, what I end up doing is that I start to change my line of aim until I can see that 1 tip's worth of left hand English is actually lined up with my target, or the chalk in this case. And when I can actually see that, I shoot. And you can see I hit the chalk right on target. Now let's try the same thing with left English. So I'm going to apply 1 tip's worth of left English and then change my line of aim until I can see that 1 tip's worth of right English is lined up with the chalk, and then I'm going to shoot. And I hit my target. So remember that whenever we're going to apply front hand English, the amount of English that you put on one side, you have to change your line of aim until that same amount of English on the left side is actually lined up with your target. In this example here, I used 1 tip of right English, so I changed my line of aim until 1 tip of left English was actually lined up with my target, and then vice versa. All right, there's just one more thing we got to go over before I start demonstrating shots, and that's how side spin affects the cue ball coming off of a rail. In every one of my videos where I talk about applying spin to the cue ball, you've heard me mention a half a tip of English, 1 tip of English, and even 2 tips of English. And they're all for good reasons, especially when trying to understand how the cue ball is going to come off of a rail. If I were to shoot this cue ball straight into the rail with no spin at all, we would expect the cue ball to just come back and hit my cue. Pretty self-explanatory. But if I apply 1 tip of right English on the cue ball, we expect the cue ball to spin off to the right, but the question is, how far off to the right do we expect it to go? Well, it's pretty concrete. 1 tip of right English will cause the cue ball to spin 1 diamond over as long as we're going the width of the table. Let's see how that looks. 1 tip of right English is 1 diamond over. So what do you think 2 tips of right English might actually do? Well, if 1 tip of right English causes the cue ball to spin over 1 diamond, we should expect that 2 tips of right English will cause the cue ball to spin over 2 diamonds or fall here in the corner pocket. Let's check that out. Two tips of right English causes the cue ball to spin 2 diamonds over to the right. Now let's look at left English on the cue ball. Here's 1 tip of left English, which should cause the cue ball to spin off to the left by 1 diamond. And now let's look at 2 tips of left English and watch the cue ball fall into the side pocket. Pretty concrete if you ask me. Now you just heard me talk about how 1 tip and 2 tips worth of English causes the cue ball to spin 1 or 2 diamonds over in the direction of the English applied whenever we shoot the width of the table. But whenever we shoot the length of the table, the number is actually doubled. Meaning that if I try to shoot the cue ball straight into the short rail with 1 tip of right English, I expect the cue ball to spin 2 diamonds over, which would cause it to come here towards this corner pocket. And then if I were to apply 1 tip worth of left English, I would expect the cue ball to spin 2 diamonds this way and come towards this corner pocket. And then remember that if I try to apply 2 tips worth of English, then the cue ball will actually come 4 diamonds over, which I can't really demonstrate when we shoot the length of the table. Now we can finally take all that information we just went over and try applying them to a couple of shots. In this first example, I set up a relatively easy cut shot on the 8 ball, and we have to get position on the 9 ball because we're playing a game of 9 ball. I have to cut the 8 ball slightly to the left, which means my cue ball will naturally go slightly to the right. So let's first take a look at where the cue ball will end up with no English at all. Not bad, but let's see if we can do something a little bit better. Now let's try the same shot, but this time with 1 tip of right English. Now isn't that a lot easier to shoot the 9 ball? Now let's shoot the same shot, but from the other side. That way we can apply left English on the cue ball. Except this time, let's apply 2 tips of left English on the cue ball. Looks like we got a lot closer to the 9 ball. For these last few shots, let's look at that opening shot that I did at the beginning of this video, where I make the 8 ball in the side pocket and get position on the 9. But first, let's see where the natural roll of the cue ball will go. It's actually not bad, but it's a very, very thin cut shot on the 9 ball. Now let's try to get better position on the 9 ball. Ideally, we would want to end up somewhere over here instead of right around here, which is where the natural roll of the cue ball went when I contacted the bottom rail. So instead of coming down this line, I'm actually going to try to apply 2 tips worth of left English to widen the angle to come over here and hit this rail and see if we can end up in our designated area. Perfect. And for our final shot, let's really try to replicate what I did at the beginning of this video and not use this rail at all and still get decent position on the 9 ball. We're going to use 1 tip of right English so that when we hit the bottom rail, instead of it coming off to our left, we're going to force it to go to the right and come straight down the table. And again, perfect. So did you make it this far? Because we just covered a lot of information regarding side spin on the cue ball. And I haven't even touched the surface of what we can do with side spin on a variety of other shots. But for now, this is where I'm going to end today's lesson. I believe I covered the most important basic parts with how to apply side spin on the cue ball using front hand English or backhand English, and how to account for that cue ball deflection when we apply side spin, and then how to use side spin to change the outbound angle of the cue ball off of a rail after you make a shot in order to play better position on the next shot. I hope everybody was able to find this video helpful. If you did, give it a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe. And here's the winner of the raffle that I had for the player's cue, who was nice enough to send me a photograph and a video of him using the cue. Take care, everybody.